I tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jay.
And this is our podcast on the Bill and Ted films. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which is a film from 1988, and Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which was made 3 years later in 1991. And they're a pair of films that we have watched and enjoyed many times, and I think they work on a couple of different levels. Stimulating, fun comedy when you're a child, and I think they work on that level when you're an adult, and you can also start to read some deeper meaning into it. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is about time travel by a couple of teenagers, aspiring band frontmen, guitarists, and it might remind one somewhat of Back to the Future and Marty McFly, and I suppose it has certain similarities, but it also has certain differences in the tone and the plot. The premise is that Bill and Ted, who don't seem like very much to their contemporaries, are rather struggling through school, and their band that they're trying to start up is no good, are actually the saviours of the human race and the world. And we're introduced to this idea right from the beginning by Rufus, a character from the fairly distant future, telling us that Bill and Ted's, or Wild Stallions, music is going to bring peace and harmony to the whole world or universe even. Ted's dad is disappointed with the way Ted is getting through life and plans to send him to Oaks Military Academy in Alaska, whereas Bill and Ted have been living in California, thus splitting up Bill and Ted and the band if Ted doesn't pass history. And so, in order to help them, Rufus, this character from the future, brings them a time machine in the form of a phone booth in which to travel around time and gather inspiration and information for their history report. And that's the Excellent Adventure. Going on this journey with Bill and Ted, who are very comical characters, a very engaging duo. They're, on the surface, a little bit thick, but on the other hand, you could say they've got their own unique way of looking at things, which also has its plus points, and they do manage to use that in order to think outside the box a bit and pass their history by bringing actual historical characters to help them with their presentation, which is a lot of fun. And one way it differs from Back to the Future is that there isn't any red tape about doing things like this, bringing people back from the past, watching out what happens when you're in another time period in case you drastically change things. You can just pretty much do what you want, as long as you're doing it peacefully, benevolently, as Bill and Ted are.
It's kind of a joke, and it's definitely a USP. These two rather airheaded Californian valley-speaking, Shirley the Loon-type speaking characters are the saviours of the world, the universe. But as you say, at the same time, it's not a joke, because the simplicity and purity of their characters and their outlook on life is what the world really needs to be saved. It's a wonderful piece of philosophy the two of them come up with, and it sums up how utopia can and maybe one day will be achieved really well. Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes. Yes, you have to be excellent to each other to achieve utopia. Being okay to each other, tolerating each other isn't enough. Being good to each other is a step in the right direction, but it's never going to achieve utopia. But being excellent to each other is the way. And of course, don't forget to take some time to party on along the way. And of course, for the films to work, Bill and Ted have to be these valley-speaking, airheaded, but under the surface, rather philosophical, astute, rather brilliant characters, and they have to really work as a pair and bounce off each other really well. And if that didn't work, the films would never have been a success. Or the first film would never have been a success, and it would never have spawned any more. And those two actors are Alex Winter as Bill S. Preston Esquire and Keanu Reeves as Ted Theodore Logan. And the thing about that is, Keanu Reeves is actually one of the worst actors in the entire world and utterly ruins films that otherwise might have bits that are okay. Like Speed and Bram Stoker's Dracula. But as we always say, being Ted is the one thing he can and did do successfully. But Alex Winter as Bill is noticeably better at evoking that kind of character. And we've always noticed that Bill is the slightly more intelligent, on the ball one.
For instance, when they don't have the phone booth yet and they're trying to study for their report, Ted starts going off on a tangent and Bill says, come on, we gotta focus. When they're back in time, Ted's all like, oh, whoa, it's like a western, it's like Wild West world. And Bill's saying, yeah, but you can get shot here, Ted, and that kind of thing.
I don't think Keanu Reeves could really have pulled off being the more on the ball one, but Alex Winter certainly can, and he keeps Bill suitably slackerish, and that really works. And Keanu Reeves as Ted, slightly more naive one who is a little way behind Bill most of the time, works really well, and the pair of them gel and make Bill and Ted an excellent screen pair to watch. So that's really what Keanu Reeves is for in this universe, and really Alex Winter hasn't done a lot of film acting. I believe he's mostly a producer, and the only other acting role I've ever seen him in is a small role in the vampire film The Lost Boys. So really it's the great crowning achievement of the universe for both of them, I think, the Bill and Ted movies, and they should both be praised for bringing them to life so well. Another important cast member is George Carlin as Rufus, who you mentioned. I think he does really well at bringing the futuristic personality where Bill and Ted's little catchphrases like excellent and yes way and things like that have become sort of day-to-day speak, and George Carlin makes it sound very natural and not silly, and you can see how Bill and Ted's affable, naive, but very pure and heartfelt way of thinking has permeated through the Utopia society, and that's a very important role in the film to make us believe what we're being told is the timeline and the whole basis for the whole movie.
I went over pretty much the whole plot of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Perhaps we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of that now. They bring back various people that you might have heard of. I think I only heard of quite a lot of them for the first time via Bill and Ted being quite young when I first saw it. For instance, Joan of Arc, Socrates, Genghis Khan. It's good fun seeing Bill and Ted in the different time periods, although they don't spend a long time in many of them, just the Wild West really. What's even better is when they bring the historical characters to the present and they get themselves into trouble in the mall. They get arrested by Ted's dad, and Bill and Ted have to break them out of jail. Things happen like Genghis Khan smashes up the sporting goods store. Beethoven goes mad on all the keyboards in the music shop. Abraham Lincoln gets into trouble with a photographer who's taking his picture and wants the Lincoln hat and the stupid beard back. And of course, Abraham Lincoln wants to hang on to those. And what really marks it out as different and more fun than other time travel is that it doesn't really seem to matter very much that these are people from decades or centuries or even millennia ago. The jeopardy is that they need to get out of jail and all get to San Dimas High School in time for Bill and Ted's history report. And then they can all go home. Although I do think perhaps they ought to take Joan of Arc somewhere else, somewhere nice where she can build a new life.
It is a lot of fun, a fun ride, an excellent adventure, all that, because the reason they take their famous historical figures to the mall is that they have to answer for the history report a stupid question like you get for oral assessments. What would these figures think of San Dimas today? Link that into your learning about history. And we've always enjoyed, even before doing secondary school work and appreciating it on a whole new level, the different presentations that we we get to see glimpses of before Bill and Ted's. And there's the girl who gets an A, who's done awfully well in telling the silly teachers exactly what they want to hear about Marie Antoinette, let them eat fast food. And then you've got the football jock who's obviously going to college on a scholarship and doesn't care that much and hasn't done it that well. But it's not a bad report and he gets the C- for it.
He's quite right. Nowadays things are more modern. There's computers. I mean, when you get right down to it, what else is there to say?
He's actually answering the question, which I think is a lot better than you can get some people to do nowadays. Set them little tasks like that. And then just to prove that not all football scholarship jock jacket wearing guys are thick, the other football guy does a middlingly good report and gets a B for it. And I think really the strength of Bill and Ted's report isn't how they've answered the question. Socrates likes baseball and things. It is on the great presentation and extra credit information put in, but they very much deserve their A's. Of course, the problem we've always noticed is they're supposed to have a figure from medieval England and they don't end up bringing one back because of rewrites. And I was saying when we were watching it this time, it would have been better if they, Bill and Ted, had got the princesses out of medieval England and had them in the history report. But then they just pop up at the end again. Rufus has gone and rescued them from marrying the royal ugly dude. So Bill and Ted's medieval bit doesn't really link in that well with the rest of their excellent adventure. And they were supposed to bring back this character called John the Peasant, and then he got written out at some point. But he's hardly a person of historical significance, or not in the way that Mr. Ryan and the other teachers would like to hear. So a bit of a plot point. Of course, another figure from one of their mandatory time periods is Napoleon, whose rather fun subplot we've always enjoyed, and that's really very silly. Throw away any sort of universal consequences of Napoleon going around San Dimas doing bowling and water slides and things, but it's just, like the whole film, a great deal of fun.
Some of those things with Ted's little brother Deacon and a couple of identical twins who he wants to double date with, I guess, and he's like, look, here's a date for one of you. And I always think they can't really believe he's Napoleon, can they? They must just think he's some nutter like everyone in the mall thinks about everybody else. But of course, during the bowling, they end up ditching him. Deacon turns to these two girls and says, let's ditch him. And then Bill and Ted are horrified to hear you ditched Napoleon. And I like Deacon's response. He was a dick. Yes, he was a dick, wasn't he? Although the Americans seem to like him. But perhaps the writers of Bill and Ted can see that he was a dick in order to achieve all the conquering and things that he did. And I think, actually, Napoleon would act in the 20th century very much as he does, taking most of the ice cream and scooping up the last spoonful and cheating at the bowling and barging to the front of the queue for the water slides and all that kind of thing.
When Sigmund Freud, as part of the history report, is psychoanalyzing Ted and talking about Ted's father transferring his own fear of failure onto Ted, that's why he's always so hard on Ted, and Ted's like, whoa. We always think and sometimes say, of course, Ted's father doesn't really seem aware that he's got another son, a younger son, Deacon. And I was saying this time, Ted's father perhaps has no idea, or if he does, he doesn't mind that Deacon is going double dating with this much older man and the two identical twins. Bit of a dodgy situation, really. You can see that Kerry and Daphne, the identical twins, obviously are very keen on Deacon because they're watching him play his baseball when Bill and Ted come and ask where Napoleon is. They're sitting at the picnic table watching Deacon and doing some studying or something. And I'll come back to that point later because there's something relevant to say about it. You mentioned the time-travelling phone booth earlier, of course, which is such a huge part of the movie. I suppose it cannot be denied, and none of the makers would try and deny, that it owes something to the TARDIS from Doctor Who for inspiration. And like the TARDIS, it's kind of implied, I think, that the phone booth exterior is a kind of disguise selected for the time period it's supposed to be in. Because in the opening of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, you can see what's obviously supposed to be the time machine in its true form, which is this sort of golden cuboid sort of structure, and then it turns into the phone booth to go back in time to San Dimas 1988. And then sometimes I get to wondering, how do the controls work if it's not always a phone inside? It's got like the phone directory for the circuits of time. Does that manifest in different ways with different disguises? Possibly. But then, of course, by the time we get to Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, the sequel, it really is just a time-travelling phone booth. One thing that struck me this time while watching Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which I hadn't really thought about before, is that I don't think the humour they try and get out of Missy is funny. And I'm tempted to say I don't think it's the kind of humour they try and get out of her nowadays, although we may have to come back to that later. Well, but you can pick up from the first movie that Missy was a senior when they were freshmen. She's now Bill's stepmother, married to Bill's dad, and it seems she's been around a bit. When she was at school, she had a thing with Mr. Ryan, the history teacher. I mean, that's not very appropriate, is it? And she gets chatted up by Beethoven and stuff. It's not the kind of character I think actresses would perhaps be lining up to play in these sorts of times.
Bill's greeting to her is, "Hey, Missy, I mean Mom," which is clearly very strange to him, this girl that's been around a bit in school and they knew her and had a bit of a crush on her, and Ted, after the prom, is now his stepmother.
I think when you first see it, that's got to be funny. Bill and Ted are coming out of school and this young woman turns up in the car going, "Hey, guys," and they're going, "Oh, hey, Missy," and Bill's saying, "I mean Mom," and we're like, "Oh, that's his mom," and then they explain it all.
Even nowadays, I think that could still work. She doesn't have to be a total slapper and have been around the block like you said. He could have still married someone not much older than his son. I mean, that happens, doesn't it? Maybe it wouldn't be funny then in that case, because why shouldn't love stretch across an age gap?
Yeah, it's with Mr. Ryan. They've already pushed her too far. Then they really carry on with that joke in the sequel, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. She's had Colonel Oates. She's now married to Ted's dad instead of Bill's dad. They speculate, who is she going to marry next? Elizabeth jokes to Ted, maybe she'll marry you, then you'll be your own stepdad. Interestingly, in that one, Missy is Ted's stepmom, but Bill is still the one who's going, "Missy, I mean Mom," because maybe Alex Winter is the one who has to carry off that joke rather than Keanu Reeves. But then at the end, one of the headlines for the future of Wild Stallions that you get during the closing of Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, Chuck De Nomolos, the villain from that movie, to wed Missy. So obviously at that point in the future, she's divorced Ted's dad and married Joss Ackland. She married everybody, which isn't really that funny or appropriate. And what else is she doing in the second movie? She's being new age. I'm going to mention again Shirley the Loon. She's doing that sort of thing that we like to laugh at the time, doing her seance.
There's one other thing she does, which I think is good use of her, which is being a confidant to Joanna and Elizabeth, and she's the person that they go to when they're upset for reasons that we'll talk about a bit later. A woman for them to go to and talk to, and a kind of mother figure in a way, but more of a contemporary for the princesses.
That's very true, and in the first movie she's very useful, isn't she, driving the car when they're going to rescue everyone from the police station, and she's very amenable. "Could you please bring the car around the back?" Sure. She doesn't care that they're breaking people out of prison. So she could be used very appropriately and usefully, and was a very positive character in the movies without these silly jokes about her getting around a bit and marrying everybody. And as we're on the subject, we might as well finish the point about Missy now. As we're recording this, the third Bill and Ted movie, Bill and Ted Face the Music, which has been released 29 years after the second Bill and Ted movie, is in the cinema. We have no immediate plans to see it, though we have seen the trailer and drawn certain conclusions about it and discuss together certain ways in which we think we might not like it. And I also have read a summary of it on Wikipedia, and one thing that is relevant to what we've just been talking about, and then we can finish the whole thing off now about Missy done and dusted, is that in the movie, Missy is married to Deacon. Now, isn't that just the stupidest thing?
Weren't you telling me that Deacon was the wrong age as well?
They've cast as Deacon someone younger than me, which is quite wrong. And they've cast as the two princesses people who are too young. I guess they don't want the characters to look too old, even though, really, I was thinking about this. Deacon should be, in 2020 when the film is set, at least 45. That's if he's 13 in the first movie. But the actor playing him is about 10 years younger than that. It's pure ageism, really, not casting the right age people to play these characters. I mean, the actresses playing the princesses, how much younger are they than Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves? About 15 years, something like that.
Some sexism there too. They don't want the women to look too old. I suspect with Deacon it's to add to the, in quote marks, humour of him being married to Missy apart from anything else. But ageism for him as well.
So little did Elizabeth know how close she was in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, saying Ted was going to be his own stepdad because he was going to marry Missy. Actually, it's happened to Deacon. And I think that is the stupidest thing and takes the joke much too far. And as we know, Deacon had already been reserved by one or both of those identical twins, Kerry and Daphne, who were so keen on him. So I don't buy that.
Of course, I think nothing of recasting the princesses because they've already done that once. And even when I was very young, I used to think I liked Elizabeth better in the first one and Joanna better in the second one. And I do stand by that. I think the actress playing Elizabeth in those couple of scenes in the first movie says her lines much better, attempts the English accent much better, and when they're there at the end and Rufus is telling them the ladies are in the band as well and that kind of thing, Elizabeth is smiling and reacting, whereas Joanna is just kind of standing there. And then in the second movie, there's not really anything very wrong with Elizabeth. She does what she needs to do fine, but I do think that they get Joanna to do a bit more because, again, I think her acting is a bit better, her reacting is a bit better, and I kind of thought if it were up to me, I would have the original Elizabeth and the second Joanna in the third movie.
So by a slightly roundabout route, we've got from the first movie to the second movie. It's something we've said about sequels to each other and perhaps on podcasts, and it's true that they always, in a way, kind of retread old ground from the first movie, kind of redo the same movie in some way to some extent, and they always kind of interfere in some way with something that's been established in the first movie. But nevertheless, as we know from things like Back to the Future, despite that, sequels can work very well. And we were discussing how Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey did very well, better than most sequels, in not retreading old ground. Of course, when we were watching the end of Excellent Adventure, and Bill and Ted were deciding, yeah, we better actually learn how to play these guitars now so we can make Wild Stallions a success and bring peace to the universe like we're supposed to. They haven't actually learned to play properly by the start of Bogus Journey. And I was saying, oh, look, even making a sequel interferes with that. Maybe we should learn how to play. Yeah, we should. And I remember watching Bogus Journey for the first time. I was surprised by that. I thought they were going to be able to play by now. But okay.
Of course, it does facilitate a very funny joke where Ms. Wardrow, who's organising the Battle of the Bands, is saying to them, you keep telling me you're going to be the greatest band ever, but you stink. And Bill, of course, it has to be Alex Winter who says this line, responds with, I know, we don't understand it either. Which kind of goes to show how Bill and Ted let things wash over them, accept things without really trying to do very much about them until they are kind of nudged into it, which is exactly what happens in the first film and in the second film.
It makes sense, as Miss Wardrow says, the girls can play, and Ted actually says they've had a head start on us, they've been learning since medieval times. But yes, I'm sure they did have musical training. Elizabeth plays the keyboard, and I'm sure they learned piano or harpsichord or whatever. And Joanna plays the drums, which isn't really exactly a medieval instrument, I don't think, but she'll be able to use the rhythm and timing and so on that she's learned in her medieval music studies. And Bogus Journey does kind of make up for it by explaining how Bill and Ted do learn to play using the time machine to help them broadcast to the world at a very specific point in time, and that tidies it all up. And you see the headlines coming for the future about wild stallions bringing peace to the Middle East and everything working out as it should and so on. And that's why making a third movie where they haven't yet written the song to save the world is a load of crap, because we already had it, we already saw it, God gave rock and roll to you was that song. And to come back to them saying they're still not being a success 30 years later is an utter farce, quite frankly. One comment I had about the trailer for the third movie was that it seemed to be attempting to rehash both of the other movies, with Bill and Ted's daughters, Little Bill and Little Ted, doing a kind of excellent adventure thing, gathering some historical figures, and also redoing Bogus Journey with some characters being in hell. And that really is all there is to complain about in relation to the third movie at the moment. So we can get on with talking about the second film, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. And you were telling me just before recording this podcast how it was managing to sidestep those traps of rehashing the first movie too much, as many sequels inevitably do.
In some ways it does retread old ground in that the future of wild stallions and thus the world is in jeopardy and Bill and Ted need to sort it out. But they're not doing it by the same method by any means. In fact, most of the film is them trying to get into a position to be able to do something, because in fact Bill and Ted have been murdered and replaced by evil robots from the future. So we've got robots, which we didn't have before, and we've got a bit later aliens, Martians, to help them. Of course, having been murdered, we get the afterlife, and I remember I was very satisfied with all the depictions of the afterlife that we saw as a child. You get the Grim Reaper, then they go through a bit, they possess Ted's dad and a co-worker, Sergeant is how he is addressed. They go to Missy's seance as ghosts, and then they get kind of exorcised to hell, which makes a lot of sense, really, given that Bill and Ted are unlikely to get into hell. They're such good people unless they're actually sent there. To get out of hell, they have to play games against the Grim Reaper, and then before death takes them back to their bodies and life, they stop off in heaven in order to get the help that they need to save the babes.
It's not like in something like Bolt or The Adventures of Sinbad, where there's suddenly aliens, and you think, aliens in this universe, what's going on? A, because Bill and Ted is very out there and can get away with a hell of a lot and have a lot of fun with it, and it doesn't really matter. But of course, in the first movie, the very first scene, introduction from Rufus, he mentions how Earth and other planets are in universal harmony because of Wild Stallion's music, so that all fits in very well together. The Martian characters, the stations who join together when they need to build something to make one big station, are a lot of fun, and really they're one word that can mean anything, station. Is responsible for demonstrating to us throughout the movie that the whole thing is predestination paradox stuff. As Rufus says at the beginning of Bogus Journey to Joss Ackland as De Normalis, time has told. There's nothing you can do about it, and it's actually already happened. And he's right, because station is already being used to mean anything, as a greeting, as an affirmation, because the predestination timeline is already in force. And of course, Rufus knows that, knows where he has to be, get back and be Miss Wardrow to let them into the Battle of the Bands, and things will fall into place from there. De Normalos actually exposes Wild Stallions to the world, attempting to do an evil plan, but actually bringing the whole future that he hates to fruition.
And all that is consistent with the first movie and kind of taken to the next level, I suppose, with all that complicated. Anomalous made it happen. But in the first movie, it's shown that, yes, it is all predestined on one single timeline. Rufus isn't going to try to change history. He's going to ensure that things happen as they did from his perspective. And we can see this when Bill and Ted make plans to use the phone booth after their history report to go back and steal and hide Ted's dad's keys to get the historical figures out of jail. They write themselves a note on the police typewriter with P.S. dark so they don't get seen by a passing cop and all that kind of thing. And they, as De Normalos calls it, play the time game for the denouement of Bogus Journey as well, where they go back in time to set things up to defeat De Normalos. We talked about Missy already and Ted's dad. You see Bill's dad, only very briefly, feeling absolutely gutted that Missy has left him. We don't see Deacon, and the only person who seems to remember him is the Easter Bunny, which tells you perhaps how wacky these movies can get, but the Easter Bunny is part of one of Ted's options.
Always made much less sense as an eternal hell than Bill having to be forced to kiss his disgusting old grandmother, also played by Alex Winter.
Very, very well, I might add. I don't think Keanu Reeves could have done that.
Yes, certainly. Depictions of the afterlife in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey are very satisfying, very full, well-rounded. You see everything you want to see. Ghosts, hell, and heaven. I mean, what more could you ask for? I've always enjoyed, particularly when I was younger, the performance of William Sadler as the Grim Reaper Death. And he is very funny.
He starts off seeming to be very serious and rather sinister, doesn't he? And then as soon as he gets Melvin, you think, oh, he's funny too.
And he is in the dreaded third movie, reprising his role as Death after 29 years. Have you come to sue me again? Perhaps he adds some humour to that movie. But we often hear in films how ghosts are spirits with unfinished business. I remember the first film I ever saw that spelled out in was Casper from 1995, which we watched quite recently and decided was actually a terrible film with terrible characters and relationships, which nonetheless had a lot of unrealised potential, which was rather a shame. And of course we see it in the 1990 movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore, and particularly Whoopi Goldberg, all putting in wonderful performance. And I was kind of comparing Ghost to Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey when thinking about Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey just before watching it, because there is a scene in Ghost where Patrick Swayze Melvin's death. Not literally like Bill and Ted do, but he sees, when he's just died, the heavenly light, and he hangs back thinking, ooh, I've just been murdered, I'm worried about Molly, I'd better hang around and do my unfinished business. The heavenly light disappears, and thus he is a ghost. And that's very much what Bill and Ted do, but in their own way, appropriately, amusingly presented. Perhaps Ted at times in the sequel is the driving emotional force of the duo. He's the one who says, oh, we can't go with death, Bill. We've got to stay. We've got to stop those evil usses. We've got to try. And Bill's like, you're right, Ted. That's nice to see Ted making a good contribution to the duo there. But that's why they stay, because they know something's gone horrendously wrong. Evil robots from the future have come to replace them and ruin their lives, so they do stay behind as ghosts to try and sort it out. It is the same thing as Patrick Swayze does. Stay behind to sort something out. Melvin Death. It's a funny, visual, pop culture appropriate way for Bill and Ted to do it to the Grim Reaper, and thus it's a very successful part of the movie. And then of course we have to have a bit of a break from the Grim Reaper during the ghost stuff and the hell stuff. But then we always enjoyed when we were little, and still do now, I think, the game contest, Death keeps losing and can't handle it. I said plum. No way, you said mustard. And all that 3 out of 5, 4 out of 7 and stuff. And that's really where Death becomes comical. And it's nice to see him hanging around being comical for the rest of the movie, getting jealous of Station. Why you're only thanking him? I made the wigs for the good robots. I helped with the shopping. I was pushing the cart. And then, of course, he joins the band, which is great fun.
Another sequence that I enjoy very much is when Evil Bill and Evil Ted, the robots, go and introduce themselves to the real Bill and Ted, of course, pretending to be from the future, and Bill opens the door to them and says, Ted, it's us again. Like, that's no big deal. And, of course, it makes sense, the conversation they have. If it weren't for the intervention of our future selves, we wouldn't have gone on a most excellent adventure through time and all that kind of thing. And they get them to prove they're really us with how many fingers am I about to hold up, which doesn't really make sense, but luckily for the evil robots, it rather backfires on Ted because he holds up 3 fingers like evil Ted has suggested. Power of suggestion, I suppose, and on some level he does believe it's him, so, I'm maybe reading a bit too much into it there, but it's also still comical when they're at the stage of kidnapping them. Evil Bill is saying, shut up, Bill, and Bill's miffed that he's being so rude to himself. I'll have to remember to be more considerate of myself when I get to be him. And when they're about to throw them off the cliff, they're desperately trying to think of a way out of it and say, even though you're doing this, we love you. And I remember finding that laugh out loud funny the first time.
Of course, it's a much better test question for your future selves in the first movie. What number are we thinking of? 69, dudes! Whoa. But yeah, how many fingers am I about to hold up? 3. Well, then you're gonna hold up 3 fingers, aren't you?
Ted holding up 3 fingers and going, whoa! It's very funny, and Keanu Reeves pulled that one off, didn't he?
I was always very happy with the depictions of hell and heaven, very much buying into collective cultural ideas about what those places might look like and what sort of people might be there. It's very satisfying. And of course, you get Frank Welker, such a prolific voice actor, providing the voices of Satan, who is pretty much the voice of Dr. Claw from Inspector Gadget, and the Easter Bunny, who's pretty much Slimer from the real Ghostbusters, and the Stations, I think, are very like that voice. There was another voice actor credited with Frank Welker, wasn't there? Neil Ross. And I wondered who he might have done. Perhaps the lines that the good robot us's say. Perhaps God, because God has one line, one word in the movie. Station. And I wasn't convinced that was Frank Welker, but maybe that was Neil Ross.
It's quite interesting that we don't actually see God. They didn't want to depict God.
I like all the steps and statues and white leading up to his throne. That's very much how I always imagined God. So there we are, lots about Bill and Ted. So there, another podcast will come to an end. But do join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in December, for a podcast on the British Empire. Back to some BBC sitcom territory there. And then not long after that, you'll be able to join us for a 2020 update podcast, where we just bring you up to date with a few things. So until December with the British Empire,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.